So, there's been a lot of coverage lately about the murder of Australian women and how this is a sign of Australia's misogyny. I think a little bit different, though. I think the way this is being covered shows male disposability and cultural misandry. And not to mitigate the issue, but I'm going to explain what I mean. So, let's look at the statistics for murder in Australia. And I'm going to start off by using one of the very articles I just showed you. Homicide events include murder 82%, manslaughter 15%, and the other cases 3%, but the most serious offense was not stated or known. The majority of victims are male, 69%. So that's a little more than two-thirds of victims are male. Then they say men are also far more likely to commit homicide according to figures. And then they basically say men are much more likely to commit murder, which may be true, but does absolutely nothing to resurrect the victim, just to add. Okay, and this is just from Wikipedia. It's a little confusing, so I've marked it. The blue line is men, the red line is women. And as you can see, in Australia, 67.3% of victims were male. That's 171 victims. And 32.7% of victims were female. That's 83 victims. But if you try and bring this up, you'll get responses like, oh, that's just a whataboutism. Well, what exactly do you mean by that? The fact that we're pointing out what about two-thirds of murder victims? Well, yes. Why isn't that a valid point? Because then they say, oh, well, this is a special women's issue, and you're trying to make it into a men's issue. Well, first of all, no, it's not a special women's issue. If women are only a third of murder victims, then it's not a special women's issue. And secondly, I think you have that backwards. You're the ones trying to make it all about women by having a conversation only about women. And then if someone tries bringing up men, who are the majority of victims, you shut them down and say they shouldn't talk about it right now. It's not the right time or place. And then sometimes they say, well, this is different. This is special. This is femicide. This is women being killed just because they're women. But the reason why that argument really doesn't make a whole lot of sense is if there was this special murder of women just for being women going on, then wouldn't you expect to see more women being murdered than men? If men are being killed at twice the rate, if men are twice as likely to be murdered, isn't it almost more logical to say that men are killed for being men? But the thing is, none of those talking points or attempts at derailing the conversation really address the main point. Why do we ignore two-thirds of victims? And why do we give special treatment to one-third of victims? Why is it that the murder of a woman is considered as a special murder, but the murder of a man is seen as just like a regular murder? It really does seem as if the value of a man's life is seen as less, and that murdering a man isn't as bad. I'm almost tempted to twist that fake Stalin quote, a murder of a woman is a tragedy, a murder of a man is a statistic. And another question I have for these people, when is an appropriate time to talk about men being murdered? Like, when are we allowed to talk about male victims? If you're saying that this isn't the time or place to talk about male victims, when is the time and place to talk about male victims? Now, to be clear, I do think there are cases of women being killed for being women. But if two-thirds of your victims are male, and yet the focus is on female victims, to me, that just shows how the murder of a man just isn't taken as seriously, and people just don't care about it as much. It just doesn't bother them as much. And to me, that's what this message very much kind of feels like. Like, my life isn't as important, and me being murdered wouldn't be as big of a deal. And as a man who was stabbed in the neck by a woman, yeah, it feels personal. Now, I'm just going to leave you with two things. First of all, if you remember my video yesterday talking about growing misogyny and how young boys are becoming radicalized and following Andrew Tate, maybe consider what it feels like if they mention how they're twice as likely to be murdered and they're told to be quiet and not to talk about it. How do you think that's going to make them react? And secondly, I'll leave you with this. Of the men in Australia who were murdered, how many of them would not have been murdered in that same circumstance had they been a woman? Just something to think about. But I don't want to mitigate any of the victims. It's tragic when women are murdered. I kind of hate how the media tries to inflame these kinds of topics, but I just felt that this had to be said. So my name is Blue Orange 22. Thanks for watching.